All right, so hello and welcome to everyone who is joining us today for our webinar, NATO's Geostrategic Interest Towards China, How Strong Are AUKUS and the Quad Really? Today's event is brought to you by the International Peace Bureau, the No to War, No to NATO Network, and the Asia-Europe People's Forum. So we thank you all for joining us here. We're very happy to have you. And without further ado, I will give the floor to our moderator, Anu Chenoy.
Thank you. Good day, everyone. Welcome to this very important webinar. And as Sean has said, this is really on NATO's geostrategic moves in the Indo-Pacific. And these moves are very clearly highly militarist. They can move into the nuclear dimension, as the recent agreement between Australia and the United States shows. And we are moving into an era where it is a de facto NATO expansionism into this earlier fairly quiet region of the Indo-Pacific. There is a new arms race which is starting. So to discuss all these aspects, we have a wonderful panel. We're going to begin with Anne Wright, who will give a brief overview. Anne is a retired U.S. Army colonel. She retired from the U.S. State Department and is known for her outspoken opposition, first to the Iraq War and now to this militarization. And she just told us that how she was arrested just a few days ago, opposing, the kind of policy which is emerging from the U.S. Congress on China. She received the State Department Award for Heroism in 1997 after helping to evacuate thousands of people during the civil war in Sierra Leone. Currently, Anne is based in Hawaii, where she works on peace and disarmament campaigns. And she's a council member of the IPB. We are privileged to have her on this webinar. Anne, the floor is yours.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Anu. And it's a pleasure to be with everyone. And we thank the International Peace Bureau for organizing this important panel, and for all of my colleagues from all over the Pacific region who will be giving in great detail information about what's going on in their particular countries. As you mentioned, I live in Hawaii, and Hawaii is the focal point of U.S. interest in the Pacific and Asia through its Indo-Pacific Command. And you can see this on the background that I have here. The Indo-Pacific Command for the United States is the coordinator, actually, for NATO expansion in the Pacific. We have seen an upswing in the number of NATO countries that have been participating in multilateral military war maneuvers, one of which is the very, very large Rim of the Pacific, which was held last year in the waters off of Honolulu, off of Oahu, where there were over 25,000 military personnel. There were over 250 aircraft, 40 vessels, 8 NATO nations were a part. NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What are they doing out in the Pacific? Well, they're part of this expansionist view from NATO of what they should be considering areas of interest, and the Pacific definitely is, with the UK, the United Kingdom, sending one of its very few aircraft carriers, the Queen Elizabeth, out to the Pacific. The French having their warships, and they still do have French colonies in the Pacific. We have various NATO partners that may not be full members of NATO, but still are a part of it, to include the country of Colombia, which one can consider a Pacific area, but the the fact that NATO is expanding is a very, very worrisome thought. And I'll just go ahead and share my screen with some information that we have. Let's see, there we go. Okay, I'll go play from the start. And so what we have was geostrategic interest toward China. And, you know, China is the focal point of all of this. In fact, as Anu mentioned, I was arrested in the U.S. Senate just this week for challenging Secretary of State Blinken and the U.S. expansionist foreign policies. And the sign that I held up was, China is not our enemy. That indeed that what the U.S. and NATO is doing is actually a very dangerous thing for the entire region and the world, and is a provocation to China. As I mentioned, the Indo-Pacific Command is the command that the U.S. military has, with all military services as a part of this, and U.S. bases all over the Pacific region, from Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and we'll go through this in just a moment. And over 150,000 U.S. military are a part of the Indo-Pacific Command. The hotspots that we think about of what NATO is looking toward, the North Korea and China, and particularly the issue of Taiwan. And just to make sure that for those people that don't live out in the Pacific area, that you kind of get a view from these two maps of how close the countries are that are the hot spots, so to speak, in international relations with North Korea, the Korean Peninsula. That'll be 70 years ago of the armistice signed, and I'm sure Sung-Hee will be talking about the things that are happening there. And then the issue of the status of Taiwan and the U.S. military and military maneuvers that are in the Taiwan Straits, that they call the freedom of seas, freedom of navigation, and the intense number of U.S. diplomats and congressional delegations that are going to Taiwan as a real provocation for the People's Republic of China. What this looks like to China, I think a lot of times we forget how do all of these things appear to the Chinese. I mean, it is their kind of front yard. The U.S. considers it its backyard. But when we look at the number of U.S. military bases that are in the Pacific, and what the Chinese are saying, well, there are national security concerns that we have, and so they have been increasing the numbers of vessels that they have, military vessels, but still not close at all to the combined tonnage of the U.S. and NATO countries in their naval forces. We'll be talking a lot about Australia because that's kind of the hot point right now from the NATO point of view, and Australia being a NATO partner, not a member of NATO, but a NATO partner. And just last week, the Prime Minister of Australia, the President of the United States, and the Prime Minister of the UK in San Diego, California, with the nuclear submarine in the background of this photograph. And it was the announcement of further ties between the Australia, UK, and US and the alliance called AUKUS, where the US, the nuclear-powered submarines from both the US and the UK may become part of the Australian inventory. And as the Prime Minister of Australia says, this is the biggest single investment in Australia's defense capability in all of our history, and costing a lot of money. And I'm sure our colleague from Australia will have much more to say about that. And also this summer, July 21st to August 4th, will be the Talisman Sabre ground war maneuvers that will have many, many countries in it, the US, Japan, and Australia being the primary ones. And in 2021, the last time this happened, it was 17,000 people with 8,000 Australians, 8,000 US, then Japanese, Canadians, South Koreans, British, and the UK presented. Another area that NATO is very concerned about, or concerned in that they want to have basing rights too, as the United States has. And wherever the US is able to negotiate agreements with countries for US military, you can be assured that that will also include NATO vessels and ground forces being a part of the agreement. And the latest one has been in the Philippines. The Philippines, where now there are 9 military installations that the United States now has access to after having been forced out of the Philippines over 30 years ago. And yet the new administration in the Philippines is allowing the United States to go to have basing rights in 9 locations in the Philippines. And of course, the Chinese are saying, what are you doing? You know, for 30 years, you've not had U.S. bases there. So the Chinese are, you know, they're concerned about the NATO expansion with naval ships coming in, that the U.S. is getting more basing rights in the Philippines and in Australia, too. We go on further into the northeastern Asian area and South Korea, large-scale live fire exercises with the U.S. and South Korea after not having any for 6 years. The one thing I'll give President Trump credit for is that he said he would talk to Kim Jong-un, which he did 3 times. And unfortunately, the last time did not end in a peace agreement, which could have alleviated the 70 years there of an armistice, which is not a peace agreement. And the North Koreans continuing now to say that we are concerned about our own national security, that the U.S. and South Korea, and now Japan are having combined exercises. So the numbers of exercises have been reciprocated by no nuclear tests yet from the North Koreans, and I hope they don't, but a large number of ballistic missiles that have been fired, generally in response to yet one more of the U.S. and South Korean exercises that are going on. So there have been a lot of agreements, overflights of B-52s right along the DMZ. So there's the hotspot of North Korea and South Korea, the Korean Peninsula, is very strong. We go on to Japan, and the Japanese government, that since World War II has had its Article 9 saying it will not have an offensive military capability. It is a defensive. But when you see what's going on in Okinawa with the construction of the Hanoko military runway, you see new runways going in on smaller islands, and the military weaponry that's going on to some of the smaller islands gives everyone great concern. Another hotspot that it was created in terms of, it is in the Solomon Islands. The Solomon Islands switched its recognition of Taiwan to the People's Republic of China, and did sign a modest security agreement with the Chinese, mainly on disaster assistance and things like that. But it certainly generated a lot of interest in the United States, to the extent that the United States is reopening its embassy, which had been closed for a long time because the U.S. was not interested in the Pacific Islands. But boy, it is now. And one of the things that was at another hearing in the U.S. Congress that I went to was on the issue of the Pacific Islands. So the U.S. is now very much concerned. And U.S. military strategy, particularly with the Marines, is an island hopping military strategy. Should it ever confront an enemy, that the Marines will be doing island hopping, similar to what happened in World War II. So the Chinese see that, and they are concerned about this. We go further into the more southern Pacific and the island of Guam, and I know our colleague Isa will be talking about the areas around Guam, but the first U.S. military Marine base in 70 years has now been created on the island of Guam. And Guam, a small little island, just like Hawaii, although the Hawaiian Islands are larger, but both the Hawaiian Islands and Guam have seen a massive increase in the numbers of military installations, the numbers of military aircraft, to include now assassin drones that are being assigned both to Hawaii and to Guam, that we've seen being used in the Middle East. And we certainly hope they won't be used in the Pacific, but they are being now assigned, 6 of them into Hawaii and 6 onto Guam. We go to a part of the world that a lot of people don't know much about, the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Republic of Palau, all part of what's called the Compact of Free Association, which the United States has the defense rights for this huge amount of space in the Pacific Ocean. The U.S. Has negotiated over the last 30 years now what's called the Compact of Free Association, where the U.S. pays all of these 3 island states, the Marshall Islands being the place where the U.S. tested atmospheric nuclear weapons back in the 1950s and early 60s. So the U.S. is currently involved in the renegotiations for the rights to be the military group in these islands. The Marshall Islands also is the end of what's called the Ronald Reagan Ballistic Missile Test Area, where intercontinental ballistic missiles are sent from the west coast of the United States, from California, all the way across the Pacific and landing in the Marshall Islands. So it's very interesting to see how these 3 very, very small island states, small in population and in actual size of the islands, but that are a part of a huge geographic area, how they are negotiating and demanding a lot more from the United States. But these are areas where the U.S. has brought ships in over the years. They've had ground forces there, small ones, but they are going to be used as a U.S. strategy of NATO to counter what the NATO and the U.S. calls, the threat from China. At the end of this presentation, I have a lot of resources. So if people are interested in finding out more of these details, I would be glad to share them with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne. That was very important and useful. Our next panelist is Cameron Leckie. He served in the Australian Army for 24 years, retiring at the rank of Major, and he was deployed on 3 operations in East Timor, Solomon Islands, and Indonesia after the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami. Over the course of his military career, he gradually came to the conclusion that Australia's defense and foreign policy was actually contrary to Australia's interests. And he hopes for that Australia maintains peaceful relations with all nations. Now, my question to you, Cameron, is that recently your former Prime Minister, Paul Keating, made a devastating critique that the deal between Australia and the US on nuclear submarines was a worst foreign policy decision since Australia decided for conscription in World War I. and that China was not a security threat, but a trading partner. So how will this nuclear submarine deal and AUKUS alter Australia's security, and what kind of impact will it have on China and the Indo-Pacific? Cameron?
Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Anu. I'm in Brisbane, Australia. It's early evening. I'd have to agree with our former Prime Minister that I think it's one, if not the worst, one of the worst decisions that any Australian government has made, this AUKUS decision. And I guess before I sort of get into it, I like to think big picture and then sort of focus down. And I guess if we look at things big picture, this book here I've got, it's called by Paul Kennedy, written 1988, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. It goes through 500 years of history where we have the rise and fall of multiple great powers over time. And I don't think it's particularly controversial to say that over the course of the future, as long as there's a human civilization, that will continue to see the rise and fall of great powers. When he wrote that book, there's a new chapter to be written, and that was the decline or the collapse of the Soviet Union. And now we've got a subsequent chapter, which is the decline, fall, collapse of the American empire. And I think that's what we're witnessing at the moment. And that's what that's what the major thing driving events in the world is that the United States is willing or desire to regain its hegemonic position. And then hence why it's, pressured Russia, it kept pressuring Russia until we ended up with conflict. We now have in Ukraine. That was one prong of their foreign policy. And now we have the same thing happening towards China. So it's essentially a nihilistic foreign policy. It's aiming for the benefit of the United States, regardless of what happens to its allies or other countries. And we have a rising world, a multipolar world where we have Russia, we have China, we have India, we have Saudi Arabia, we have Turkey, and a bunch of other countries starting to work together to counter this hegemonic ambition of the United States. So I guess that's my first snapshot is in the big picture. That's what's driving this. In Australia, is obviously we had Aboriginals living here for 40,000 or 60,000 years before Europeans arrived in 1788. But ever since then, we've been dependent on other powers for our security, or at least the perception of it. And so obviously that was first with the British, and at the end of the Second World War, it transferred over to the United States. And we have what's recent, I think it was Keating himself who phrased it as the Austral Australians. So Australian citizens, but they're so embedded with the belief in the importance of the United States to our security that they can't see the difference between Australia's national interest and the national interest, and the United States' national interest. And it's provoking some quite strong, and this is prevalent in both politics, in the media, in defence and security circles, and in organisations such as the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which is one of the organisations, or ASPI as it's called, which is one of the organisations that is really driving the China as a threat narrative in Australia. And it's been, well, I thought it had been quite successful, but with the announcement of AUKUS, and particularly the submarine deals last week, there's been a big backlash against it, which is encouraging. So that backlash has included Prime Minister Keating, and I think there's up to 11 or more senior Australian retired politicians who are speaking out against AUKUS. They're getting, major segments in the local media, which is a great thing today. And it seems every day there's a new voice adding their resistance to this AUKUS deal. So today, for example, there's John Hewson, who's a former leader of the Liberal Party in opposition, who wrote an excellent article, questioning the whole premise of AUKUS in the Saturday paper. So these are all very good signs from my view. And I think they build on a lot of the work that's happened by civil society groups, including two that I'm part of, being the Independent Peaceful Australia Network and the Australians for War Powers Reform. So, for example, over the last couple of years, IPEN produced a report called Charting Our Own Course, which engaged the Australian public on our alliance with the United States and where it was heading. It's been tabled, it received almost 300 submissions and has been tabled in Parliament. It shows that there is a growing number of Australians who are questioning the alliance because they can see that it's no longer in our interest. So I guess I think they've done themselves a disservice. Like $368 billion has been put to, or has been quoted as the figure for these nuclear submarines. And obviously it's an enormous amount of money for a country like Australia. It'll probably blow out because it's a very high risk procurement strategy. So the cost will probably only go up. And that's going to come at the cost of things such as education, healthcare, energy, climate change, or whatever other issues that Australia faces, which, you know, there are numerous. So I think we're at a good opportunity at the moment to really gather some momentum in people arguing back against AUKUS, arguing back against the narrative that China is a threat. I don't see it as a threat. It's a major trading partner, without which we would be in all sorts of dire economic trouble. So we need to be building on that relationship, not fighting to undermine it and therefore undermine our own prosperity for the foreseeable future. I might leave it there, Anu, unless there's any other follow-ups.
Thank you, Cameron. And now we have Jun Chisaka, who's Secretary General of the Japanese Peace Committee and co-chair of the Organizing Committee of the World Conference Against ANH Bombs. And he leads a campaign against US bases. So really, Jun, we're also worried about Japanese massive militarization and the change in their constitution. So if you would just give us a background on that.
Thank you very much. With the help of Rieko's interpretation, I'm going to make the presentation. So regarding today's theme, so it is undeniable that China is one factor that has contributed to the deterioration of the security environment in this region. As Wright had just said, China's military buildup, especially its nuclear missiles, its unreasonable territorial claims, and actions over Japan's Senkaku Islands and the South China Sea. It also has intensified its military threats over Taiwan, based economic cooperation with Russia without criticizing its aggression against Ukraine, and it continues regressive attitudes toward human rights in Hong Kong. These factors have contributed to heightened tensions. Heightened tensions in the region. We criticize these issues and call on China to join the TPNW, to act from the standpoint of disarmament, and to act in compliance with the UN Charter and international law. We believe that the issues surrounding China should be resolved by raising such international public opinion. Another significant factor aggravating the situation in the region is the US-led move to exaggerate, as Wright said, the Chinese threat, mobilize allies such as Japan, South Korea, and Australia in the military encirclement of China, and strengthen cooperation with NATO. This is a move by the US to mobilize its allies and other nations in an effort to gain an absolute military advantage in the great power competition with China. This move has created a vicious cycle of military to military and nuclear to nuclear, heightening the military tension and creating the danger of war. Particularly, the strengthening of the Japan-US military alliance and the massive military buildup based on Japan's national security strategy and other measures adopted at the end of last December are extremely dangerous. The strategy is to strengthen the US posture to use nuclear weapons, while the Japanese government will abandon its traditional posture of exclusive defense based on Article 9 of its constitution, which states that Japan will not wage war and will not possess military force. And the self-defense forces of Japan will acquire a large number of offensive weapons and long-range missiles that can preemptively attack other nations. In 5 years, Japan will double its military spending and become the world's third largest military power. The self-defense forces will be integrated into the US integrated missile defense system, and under the command of the US military, the self-defense forces will be ready to launch a preemptive attack, an all-out attack on other states, together with the US military. Among other things, Japan is strengthening its military posture, especially in Okinawa and the Nansei Islands, under the banner of Taiwan contingency, is Japan's contingency, while waging a campaign to make it look as if a Chinese invasion of Taiwan could happen at any moment. In addition, it is strengthening military exercises and military collaboration, not only with Japan and the US, but also with Australia, India, the UK, France, Germany, Canada, and other NATO member countries. The main focus of the Japan-US exercises is to use the Nansei Islands as a battlefield and use them as a base from which to attack China. In fact, only 5.1% of Taiwan's citizens are in favor of independence immediately. And it is possible to resolve the issue peacefully without causing a Taiwan contingency. However, the agitation for a Taiwan contingency and the strengthening of military posture in the region are increasing military tensions and creating the danger of war. We believe that such foolish military expansion and strengthening of military alliance must be stopped. And we are now campaigning against this massive military buildup. Thank you very much. That's my answer to question.
Thank you. Thank you, June. And now we have Choi Sung-Hee. She's part of the struggle, and she's very much part of the Korean peace movements, part of the struggle opposing the Jeju Navy base, the militarization of Jeju, and several other areas. She's also a Korean board member of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. Choi, your floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll share the script here. Wait a minute. Oh, okay. Let's see. Okay, can you see my screen? Can you see?
Yes.
Hello, thanks so much to the organizers for having me. Jeju, the island in the south tip of Korea, is located close to China. China is South Korea's biggest export country. South Korea's export to China amounted to 20.8% as of 2022. United States is the second, 16.1%. The incumbent Yoon Suk-yeol government, the right-wing and the conservative, stipulated in its Indo-Pacific strategy last December that China is the country whom she has to cooperate with, which indicates South Korea cannot openly make hostility against China because China is critically important in South Korea's economy. However, the new government is totally subordinate to the United States, considering itself as the United States stormtroopers. For the United States, it has become much easier to establish the trilateral ROK United States-Japan alliance, which would work as the Asian version of NATO. NATO and the ROK United States-Japan trilateral alliance, both are the two keys for the United States, not only to confront China, Russia, and North Korea, but also to dominate the global. And it is very important to emphasize that the missing link due to the historical imperial colonial relationship between Republic of Korea and Japan is now strengthened because of Yoon's pro-Japan propensity and Japan's rearming. Given that this year hits the 70th year of Korea armistice, such a strengthening war alliance is tragic and dangerous more than ever. You can check endthekoreanwar.net to sign up for the end of Korean War. And the United States is trying to include South Korea, Australia, and Japan, and New Zealand beside NATO for her global domination strategy. The trilateral alliance and AUKUS can compensate for the Quad. It should also be said that the danger of a nuclear war is growing. How about South Korea? The South Korea Yoon Suk-yeol government is openly talking about nuclear sharing policy with the United States. He and some of his party members even talk about nuclear weapons deployment in South Korea. This January, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a conservative United States think tank, recommended the US government to examine simulation training in preparation for the redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons in the Korean Peninsula. Heritage, another conservative US think tank, has proposed to install a NATO-type nuclear plan consultative group with South Korea, which is to strengthen US expansion deterrence. What is a nuclear expansion deterrence? It is another word for the nuclear preemptive strike. The NATO-type nuclear plan consultative group means the US can deploy nuclear weapons in South Korea, and South Korea can carry nuclear weapons under the lead of the United States, which is a violation of non-nuclear proliferation treaty and totally ignores the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. The dangerous proposal on the NATO-type nuclear plan consultative group and existing AUKUS are all signifying the NATO expansion and growing danger of nuclear wars in the Pacific and world. How about Jeju? Jeju has become an outpost for the United States against China with the construction of Jeju Navy base in 2016. And there is a South Korean government project called the Second Jeju Airport. It is highly likely that the airport would be an Air Force base. Last December, a special committee of Yoon's conservative ruling party made a report which was mentioning the need to consider the construction of the runway where US strategic bombers taking on off are possible, and temporary storage for nuclear weapons for the second airport construction. We should never let such schemes be realized. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Choi. And now we have Theresa, that's Ariola. She was born and raised in the island of Saipan in the northern Mariana Islands. She earned her PhD from the University of California in socio-cultural anthropology. Her research focus is on the socio-political implications of contemporary militarization throughout the Marianas archipelago. And she teaches militarism, indigeneity, and Oceania. So, Isa?
Thank you very much, Anu, and thank you to IPB for having me here today. Let me see if I can start this. So can everybody see this?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So yeah, today I'm glad Anne did that overview that talked a little bit about Guam, but since I'm from the CNMI, I'm gonna highlight the CNMI's role in this broader conversation that's happening. And in particular, what I want to do is point to 4 major projects that have emerged out of the US concern over Chinese influence in the region, which largely began as part of the broader Pacific pivot in the early to mid 2000s under the Obama administration. So you can see here that there's 4 kind of major projects: the Guam and CNMI military relocation, which originally included at the time the move of 9,000 troops and their dependents from Okinawa to Guam, and that has since shifted to around 5,000, but it's still in the works. And then the Tinian divert infrastructure improvements that I'll be talking about. And I kind of shorthand that often by calling it the divert. The Mariana Islands Training and Testing Study Area, and the CNMI Joint Training Project that's currently in the works in the Mariana Islands. So in this first slide, I want to highlight the MIT, the Mariana Islands Training and Testing Study Area, which emerged in 2010, originally emerged in 2010 as the Mariana Islands Range Complex. And in 2015, it was transformed into what's now the MIT. So you can see the red dotted line on the map demarcates the original kind of bombing range that was created for the region and blanketed the Mariana Islands. And then beyond the red dotted line, you see how basically the area was doubled in 2015. So it went from around 500,000 square nautical miles to around just under 1 million square nautical miles, where the US military is training and testing all throughout the waters and the land and the air in the Mariana Islands. And then you see that yellow dotted line is the transit corridor that connects the MIT to the Hawaiian Islands Range Complex. So in particular, this MIT was, the creation of this MIT was really important for the military's continued bombing access to places like Faralanda and Deniza, which has been used as a US bombing range since 1971. And you can see it here on the right side of the map in the MIT environmental impact statement that was released to the public, CNMI public, in 2015. And you note that there's a 12-mile advisory zone around FDM because of the bombing. And so the access is restricted, fishing access, that kind of stuff is restricted from this particular island. It's very, the military leased this island in 1983 for only $20,600 to be used as a bombing range. And that agreement was set to last 50 years with an option to renew for another 50 years. So this is an island that is continuously bombed throughout the year. And so what we're also seeing is the major kind of militarization or hyper-militarization of the island of Tinian, which is already 2/3 of the island of Tinian is already DoD-controlled leased land. But Tinian in 2016 was chosen as the alternative, as an alternative site and this includes infrastructural improvements to the Tinian International Airport, road construction projects that support military activities, and actually a fuel pipeline as well that you could see the map on the right here, a fuel pipeline, an underground fuel pipeline that's supposed to go from the seaport to the airport. So we're seeing a flurry of militarization and military plans on Tinian right now that are really concerning, and the kind of hardening of this alternative base on the island of Tinian that really exemplifies the military strategy of dispersing forces throughout the Pacific without concentrating them in one particular area. Excuse me, sorry. And so one of the things I wanted to highlight is the way that the media is picking up on this air base on Tinian. And this was a particularly striking article, but again, it really exemplifies the kind of perspective that's being blanketed over our islands, and particularly in the Northern Marianas, is that the construction of the air base on Tinian is there in place of Guam getting quote unquote knocked out, right? So there's this idea that, okay, the U.S. forces need to increase their presence on Tinian and Saipan and other islands, and potentially other islands in the Northern Marianas Archipelago, in case of an event on Guam that would reduce the military's ability to react to China, say, for example. And I also wanted to note that just very recently, earlier this month, that this also is exemplifying the kind of importance of Tinian in this broader move to militarize the Marianas, is that F-22 Raptors came from Kadena Air Base from Japan and we're actually launching from the Tinian International Airport. So there's a lot of exercises that are happening on the island right now. The last project that I wanted to point out is what's called the CNMI Joint Military Training project that's being led by the Marine Corps. And as you can see here, this was actually a 2015 project that proposed the use of the islands of Tinian and Pagan, which is a northern island in the Northern Marianas chain, to use for live fire training. So this really destructive kind of training that they wanted to increase in Tinian and actually use Pagan for the first time for this live fire training. And it was met with such fierce opposition by the community and others that the environmental impact statement that was released about this particular project garnered 30,000 comments. And it actually forced the Pentagon to take Pagan completely off the table in this project because there was so much resistance to it. But the problem is we're still waiting for the kind of updated EIS right now, the updated environmental impact statement we're not entirely sure, or at least the public isn't, what these plans are going to include, except for more training in Tinian. And lastly, I just wanted to showcase this also very recent event in which is an example of the way our islands are being impacted by this broader debate, just one of the many examples, but that there is an intense economic militarism that's occurring as a result of these critical conversations. And that is that the CNMI, our CNMI governor recently, in his testimony before the U.S. Senate Committee on the State of U.S. Territories, noted that in order to support the United States in its national security endeavors, essentially, we are going to pivot our economy, our tourism market away from China, which is very interesting, considering that 50% of our base and over 200,000 people from China came to visit pre-COVID times to the Mariana Islands. So very significant tourism base. And we're seeing this shift towards further reliance on military funding to support our economy. And I wanted to highlight that as a very kind of alarming development that's happening in the CNMI right now. I think I'll stop there. I might have taken up my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Isa. So we'll go into a second round, a brief second round, in which I hope all of you can focus on how are people responding, or people's movements and peace movements, and if there are alternate visions of security. What about the opposition party, or any other issue that you would like to take up which you didn't in the first round? So, Anne?
Well, I will just tag on to what Isa mentioned in hers about the U.S. putting pressure on a lot of countries to really stand or push back on China in a variety of ways. And the president of the Federated States of Micronesia, just in early March, released 13-page letter that details what he characterizes as his concern about the influence of China on his country. And although the Federated States of Micronesia has recognized the PRC since the 1990s, in fact, I was a U.S. diplomat out in Micronesia at the time when the FSM switched from Taiwan to the PRC, and the PRC had agricultural projects and things like that, just like the U.S. has had Peace Corps and other projects, in all of the islands. Well, interestingly enough, the outgoing president just wrote this 13-page letter that where he details what his concern about what China is doing. And in many ways, when I heard this at this congressional hearing, it reminded me exactly of what the U.S. has done in all the countries. So the kind of the two faces of this, that the U.S. can get away with doing things, but when China, I wouldn't say mirrors them, but uses some of the same techniques and tactics that the U.S. has used for decades, then that's not appropriate. So the double standard that we have about what China is doing, as just about the largest economy in the world now, and certainly with population, number 2 in population after India, I guess. And so the hypocrisy of it all is quite startling. Thank you.
That's really true, because we can't condone what China is doing either, but we have a very distinct and separate position that whatever both these militarized, one hegemon and one aspiring one, we want no to any hegemony, no to any dominance. So, Cameron?
It's an important point. I guess the way I look at it is China exists. It's lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty over the last few decades, and I think that's what its primary aim is, to improve its economic situation for the majority of its people. I don't think it's militaristic in the way that the United States has been, but in saying that, it obviously has significant military capabilities, and it may not always be that way. So what we need to come up with is an approach where we can have, there's always going to be some level of competition, but that doesn't turn into conflict. And that's where what worries me the most is that things are so tense at the moment, and it looks like some countries in particular are looking for an opportunity to spark something for their own domestic purposes. And I guess I'm more worried about the United States doing that than I'm about China. And I guess that links back to my point previously. I think China and the greater Eastern world are on the way up, whereas the Western world is on the way down. And so they don't need to necessarily trigger a military conflict, where it could work to the benefit of the sort of broader collective West, to try and upset the apple cart and bring China down a peg or two so that they can regain their balance. So that's what worries me the most, is that we have some conflict, and particularly because things are so tense. It may not necessarily be a deliberate decision, but all these incursions and demonstrations, they increase the risk of something untoward happening. And as we saw with the balloons flying over the United States not that long ago, how visceral the reaction was to that. So we can imagine if something happens in the South China Sea, that it could get out of hand very quickly. So we really need some off-ramps to lower the tension somewhat. And I guess I had three points like where we need to go. And I guess it's from an Australian focus, but the first of them, and the most immediate, is we need to maintain the intellectual assault on AUKUS, because I think AUKUS will collapse under the weight of its own absurdity. And I don't use that term lightly. I think it is an absurd proposition. We have, three Anglo-colonialist powers, or two of them colonialist powers, and one the result of that. And I think it's really a sign of desperation. It's a sign of weakness. And it's not going to, I can't see what it's going to achieve other than bankrupt Australia and place Australia in a very awkward position with regards to, where it gets its economic prosperity from. And these submarines aren't designed to defend Australia. They're designed to operate in the South China Sea. So just join the dots. They're not for Australia's benefit. They're just another tool of the US, in which the United States can pressure Australia to join a conflict in China, which would be devastating for Australia. I think Australia's actually boxed itself into a lose-lose situation. So if we go to war with China, we lose big time. I think we'll have our own century of humiliation coming up. Australia will tangent our future sort of development path will tangent, not in a good way. And I don't see, not in my lifetime or my children's lifetime, that we'll recover from that. And even in the event there isn't a conflict, just the tensions with our major trading partner and the major driver of economic growth around the world, which it is, we're losing out. So we're losing out to the United States and things such as beef. And I'm pretty sure that Russia and China are that closely linked that we'll be losing out, trade to Russia with energy and stuff like that. So we're in a lose-lose situation. But the second thing we need to do is propose an alternate defence strategy, because obviously Australia is intimately linked with the United States, and we need an alternate. And the model I think is the most relevant is what Vietnam has, which they call a free no. So it's no foreign military bases on Australian soil, and we have numerous US military bases, permanent troops permanently stationed. There's B-1 bombers have been stationed about 40 kilometres where I live for several months now. So we need to start the process of putting the political pressure on to get rid of those bases. We don't need any military alliances. Now, we have ANZUS, but that is unlike the NATO Article 5. There's no actual requirement for Australia or New Zealand or the United States to go over to war as a result of ANZUS. There's a requirement to consult, but then it's up to each nation as to what they do as a result. So we can still have ANZUS. Well, I prefer to get rid of it. We can still have ANZUS, but we need to back out as much as we can without upsetting the apple cart too much, because, as John Mearsheimer says, you don't want to be making an enemy of the United States when you're your ally. And the last point that I make is that the military threat, I don't think, is the greatest threat we face. The major threat we face is environmental, it's economic, and it's energy related. And it's what Dr. Elizabeth Bolton, another fellow former Army officer in the Australian Army, calls the hyper threat. And she's actually developed a plan called Plan E to address this hyper threat. And we're sort of getting, all this attention being focused on the military, and that's coming at the cost of actually dealing with the real issues that, will impact our civilization for centuries to come. We're not dealing with those as effectively as we could because of all that militarisation. So we need to mount the intellectual argument to minimise or stop this militarisation, so we can actually focus on the really important long-term impacts that these threats will have on us. Thanks, Anu.
Thank you for those. That's very important intervention. And I fully agree with what you're saying. And now we have June, if you can add.
So what people are thinking and what kind of movement we are planning to hold. Is that what I should say? Yes. Russia's aggression in Ukraine continues to unfold, and the Taiwan contingency crisis is being called for, and North Korea repeatedly launches missiles. In Japan, too, public opinion is growing toward the need to build up military forces and strengthen the US-Japan military alliance with fears of war. Kishida's administration's policy of massive military buildup was initially supported by a majority of the public. However, as citizens' movements and some opposition parties' pursuit of the issue have revealed its dangers and the fact that it leads to higher taxes, some surveys have indicated a majority of opposition see the 43 trillion yen increase in defense spending However, with the media and major opposition parties taking the position of approval, I feel that unless we, the citizens movement, boost public opinion in opposition, we will not become a truly major movement. At the same time, it is also true that as a result of the long-standing post-war peace movement, more than 70% of the Japanese public opinion believes that Japan should join the DPNW, and that the most important thing in security is non-military diplomatic efforts. So many who believe that the majority, the major military buildup is unavoidable, also believe that this will serve as a deterrent to aggression against Japan. In reality, however, the buildup of Japan to attack enemy territory and the strengthening of the Japan-US military alliance will only lead to further military buildup by China, North Korea, and Russia, inviting them to attack Japan more quickly and more forcefully, which will only further increase the danger of war. Moreover, the military expansion is intended to allow Japan's self-defense forces to play an offensive role in US-led wars against China, North Korea, and other countries. So it is not for the defense of Japan. As a result, Japan will be subject to a storm of retaliatory attacks, and Okinawa, the Nansei Islands, and the entire Japanese territory will become battlefields. Japan, which has more than 50 nuclear reactors, nuclear power plants, out the country is attacked, the Japanese archipelago will become unhabitable. That is why this military build-up plan includes a plan to fortify about 300 self-defense forces bases and 23,000 buildings across Japan to be able to withstand nuclear, chemical, biological attacks. We want to tell many citizens that this is a very stupid expansion of military forces and strengthening of military alliances. By joining the US war, Japan will be turned into a sport land, or Northeast Asia will be exposed to a nuclear war. So what we have to do is very opposite of this. Japan must join the DPNW, call on other nations to join the treaty, and expand the non-nuclear trend in Asia. Instead of military alliances, we must create an inclusive peace framework, which all nations with different positions come to the negotiating table and strive for resolution of this in the direction that ASEAN is pursuing at East Asia Summit and other forums. The Constitution of Japan, based on Japan's reflection on the horrors of the war that it caused, resolved never to go to war again, renounce military power, and to take the lead in promoting disarmament in the world. We believe that now is the time these efforts based on this Constitution, and we will raise our all-out efforts to do this. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Choi Sung-Hee, well, how strong is any opposition to this massive militarization which is going to take place in Korea?
Oh, yeah. With the peace-loving people in South Korea demand the dismantling of ROK US-South Korea cooperation and alliance. We demand the stop all war exercises, which intensify the militaristic tension in the region, destroy the ecosystem, and aggravate the climate crisis. In South Korea, there are war drills in around 200 days in a year. Alliance for whom? War drills for whom? An alliance is a frame to exclude, to make enemies. It is in violation of the UN Charter, which promotes equality and peace among all countries. In 2018, there were important inter-Korean summit meetings. The meetings declared the end of all the hostilities and paced disarmament. 5 years later, those principles are abandoned and big war drills have returned with more dangerous scales. But we notice such war drills only benefit armed corporations. I am showing two videos. The first is the video of people's protest in Seoul who oppose the latest ROK US war drills. And the second is the video of people in Gangjeong who protest against the US warship who recently visited the Jeju Navy base. We, the people in Korea, will not allow militarism and war to occupy our planet. Thank you. I'm showing the two videos. Yeah, so let me make a screen sharing first to a video to show the two videos.
있습니다. 억제하고 점령함으로써 나올 수밖에 없도록 하겠습니다. 이런 Yes, peace. Yes, peace. Make peace. 요구입니다. 1만 3천 명이 그런데 우리가
계속 전쟁을 연습하면은 상대방을 도발하는 행위가 될 수 있다고 생각해요. 그러면 결국에는 언젠가 싸우게 될 수도 있다고 생각을 합니다.
Yeah, the second video will be shown. Yes, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. So now, Theresa, if you can explain what's happening, especially amongst the local people, how they are reacting to this increased U.S. presence.
Yeah, so there's indeed, actually, Anne mentioned in the very beginning, there's a burgeoning resistance movement, right, against all of what's happening in the Mariana Islands. She mentioned the group Protegilan Texan, Save for Tinian. and the group that I'm engaged with in the CNMI too is really trying to actively, be a kind of moderator between not just government agencies and the military, but between the community and what's happening with the military and government agencies. There's a real disconnect that we're seeing there in the population back home. And, we have very high enlistment rates. We're viewed as the tip of the spear, but really what these questions are getting me to think of, right, is that our people, and many of our people feel this way, is that our islands are being weaponized, right? Our islands are who's benefiting. It's really hard to kind of parse out where the money is going, right? And who's benefiting from all of the increase and buildup. There's billions of dollars that are being invested. I believe 2.2 billion in Guam for infrastructural projects, for example. And so a lot of the militarization is being touted as a business opportunity, essentially, right? And so the question is, what good are all of these business opportunities if we have a target on our back and our environments are being irreparably damaged? We have a very long history of imperialism in our islands, and I think sometimes even our own people forget that this idea of strategic, right, that the military loves to push, that the Pentagon pushes so often, doesn't mean special, right? Like, we're not special, it's not self-importance, it's strategic to defense, Pentagon goals, right? So strategic in military parlance has been used to justify land taking, bombing, all kinds of things, right? And so we're really seeing a kind of questioning and pushing back on that narrative, and we're trying to kind of shift that narrative, right, away from that framing. And so there's a few things that in these kind of resistance movements, but particularly from the CNMI, that I'm thinking of, and that is to support Indigenous sovereignty, independent of military whims and policies, right? So really, even if we're focusing on policy, for example, local policy, we need to boost connection to our lands and investment to our lands. Anytime we see that those things are being threatened or taken away, we know as a rule of thumb, that's what we need to protect, right? And also to highlight the relationship with the United States, at least with the CNMI, because we are a U.S. Commonwealth, is a two-way street, right? It's not something where we're supposed to be told what to do constantly, right? When it comes to increasing militarization in the region, it's something where we need to actually recognize our bargaining power in all of this, Anne mentioned the letter by Penuelo, and that kind of highlights the regional power that we can have in this conversation, right? Where we, instead of finding ourselves, which many people often say this back home, is that they feel stuck, right, between the US and China. There's this sense that, okay, if the US leaves, what's going to fill that vacuum, right? And that's a very myopic way to look at the conversation. And just two more brief things. We really need to reassess our relationship with the United States. Really, what are the benefits that we're gaining if everything is becoming so militarized, including our own immigration system and all of these, rights that we were supposed to be afforded in a trade-off for self-defense? What are we gaining from all of this? And lastly, again, to kind of highlight and recognize our power as a broader, as a coalition of broader Pacific Islands and Oceania more broadly, especially in Micronesia, right? So, all of that is to say that that we actually do have a say in our futures, right? And we need to start acting like that, because the future of our islands really depends on that.
Thank you for that. And now we do have some time for questions. You can put them in the Q&A box or in the chat. And please do tell us who the question is addressed to, if any. So the floor is open for questions. Or if any of the participants want to ask questions of each other.
Yes, I would like to ask Isa, the information that you gave us, particularly about Tinian and the huge amount of development on that tiny island. That's really startling. And the more information we can get to give to, our communities throughout the Pacific area, the better we are. So thank you all for that. Have you noticed that is that new runway or the airport, is it being used for like B-52s as well as just fighter aircraft? Do you know much about how that's being used?
No, I don't, but I can look that up. And also, Anne, you reminded me that the sources for that I can also share and put up the sources that were related to the PowerPoint that I presented. Yeah,
that would be
my understanding right now is the infrastructure is sorely lacking at the moment of the runway, and not nearly obviously comparable to what you would have on Guam, for example. Right. But that's the whole point of the kind of divert infrastructure project, is to really build that up and beef it up so that those kinds of aircraft can continue to land in the area on the island. Yeah.
And then how many of the folks that are permanent residents of the island, have they been moved off or moved to a different part of the island, or what's happening to the local population?
No, but there is a large of a movement really questioning and resisting these moves, right? In particular, the Tinian Women's Association, for example, right, that have long been critical of the military continuing to use the land for its purposes. So they're already, like I mentioned, 2/3 of the island are already DoD controlled land. So what you're seeing is more of a beefing up of those lands that are already under lease. But I will say, with this upcoming project, the CJMT, this is why we're kind of patiently waiting to see what the military is going to unravel there, because I believe that that's going to include a lot more training, perhaps more space that's going to be taken up on the island, right? And so this is something we're really keeping our eyes on. The government is currently in discussions with the Pentagon about this particular project. And I also want to mention that, yes, they took PAGAN off of the table, right? But PAGAN was never meant to be used as a defense asset ever in our covenant agreement, right? So taking that off the table was something that should have never been on the table, right, to begin with. So I think that's an important point to mention. We're all very grateful that it's off the table, but again, it shouldn't have been there to begin with.
If I could just mention one other thing, you said that the lease of the small island Nos Falaran Medellina, and I'm saying that wrong, I'm sure, for $20,000 and a lease for 50 years. Well, that's similar to what the Department of Defense did to Hawaii when they leased 27,000 acres for 65 years for $1. And that lease is coming up, lease on those lands, and that's one of the issues that we as the citizenry of Hawaii are pushing back on, saying to our state of Hawaii, don't you lease any of that land again. We want it all back. So land back is another big, important issue, I think, for all of us in all of our countries, to try to get back as much as the land that the U.S. military has had for decades.
Absolutely. I think that when the lease is up in 2033, that would be a major touch point, right, for resisting against releasing this island that's been really devastated by this bombing. It's a great point. Thank you, Anne.
I have a question for Cameron. Are the climate and environmental activists active against AUKUS in Australia?
Yeah, I probably can't answer that in too much detail, but I know when AUKUS was announced, a whole bunch of different groups from peace and environmental groups, union groups got together to what's called the Anti-AUKUS Coalition. So I don't have a lot of detail on it, but there's certainly there's that nexus. It's been noted that between all these issues, they're all inextricably linked, and even one of the themes of the charting our own course report that the Independent Peaceful Australia Network developed was based around the environment, also First Nations. So it covered a number of those themes and the environmental costs of militarism, war, and I guess the bigger, I mean, they're those direct costs, but I guess what I worry most is that the opportunity cost, because every dollar we put into defence is a dollar that's not spent on something, for our longer term benefit. And that's, we need to mount this intellectual argument and pressure. And I think we are at a bit of a tipping point, as I mentioned. I think, the peace groups and that sort of haven't been able to get into the mainstream. But I think with this AUKUS submarine announcement and just the sheer cost, I reckon they might have got away with it if it wasn't so expensive. But the enormous cost of it is having a lot of people sit back and go, how are we going to afford this? How are we going to pay for it? And what, at what cost? What are we going to miss out on? And it's just a bad business deal, if nothing else. $368 billion for a handful of submarines in a few decades' time, which will probably be obsolete technology by then. So, I guess there are my comments there.
There are a couple of comments in the Q&A box. Basically, some are asking Anne for sharing her statement, which we will do on our respective websites. This whole recording will come on the IPB and the AEPF website. Then there is a comment from Ulla Klotzer, who says that a group of women from different countries are planning a women's No to NATO event in Brussels. And Anne is also involved in this. And if women in various countries can contact her, that will be nice. That's another comment. Then, of course, there's thank you for all your presentations. And Kaya asks, which island is seen in Jun Chisaka's background? So, Jun, is there any specific island in your background which you can name?
This island is located in Kyushu. The name of the island is Mageshima, a small island. So related to today's discussion, this Mageshima is now not inhabited, but used to be inhabited. And rich biodiversity, but the government has bought the whole island and to make it as the landing practice site. To offer to the US military. But actually, the government paid the 4 times more money to the landowner to make it the training field. Actually, this island is located at the tip of the Nansei Island, which leads down to Okinawa. So the militarization actually, as you other analysts said, destroys the environment and the people's lives and the rich culture. On Mageshima Island, construction just started and local people are fighting very fiercely against this plan. The name of the island is Mageshima.
Okay, thank you for that. Another anonymous attendee has actually said that he thinks that, or she thinks that a lot of this is being driven by what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, which is huge with a lot of dollars to be made, and we need to somehow make armaments and wars much less profitable. Actually, they're becoming more profitable. So that is a comment. I think everyone agrees with that the military-industrial complex is very closely now linked with governments, and it's a very profitable enterprise. And the last comment So there's no question really, is that, and I think Anne already spoke of this, that is Lyndon Johnson announced a lease of the Northwest Cape in Australia in the 1960s for $1, and it's still a US base. So that is all in terms of comments and questions. And just to conclude, can everyone get 1 minute just to make one last concluding point, and we will end it there. So we can begin again with Anne.
Well, it's been a real pleasure to be with everyone, and it's so important that we talk about the NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, moving into the Pacific as a worldwide military force, and the pushback that we see in all of our countries against the expansion of militarism throughout the Pacific and Asia, and the fact that our countries, and particularly mine, the United States, seems to always need an enemy, and China is the big time enemy in the Pacific and Asia. And I think we all, there are criticisms we have of every government, and certainly there are plenty of criticism for China, but it's no reason that China should be our enemy. It's an economic competitor to the United States and other countries, but it should now be considered as a national security threat. And it is being used by the US particularly and other countries as a way to increase the profits that go to the military-industrial complex, and is a payoff in many ways to our politicians. So I say China is not our enemy. We should not have enemies, and we should have real diplomatic discussions and negotiations rather than wars. Thank you.
Thank you. So Cameron, your last 1 minute.
Yeah, thanks, Justine. Thanks for the opportunity to speak tonight. I 100% agree China's not our enemy. Obviously, we're always going to have disagreements with all sorts of countries around the world, but it doesn't make them our enemy. I guess military strength is a function of economic strength, and the way I see it is that the Eastern world has increasingly more important economic strength, and as a result, they'll become military more powerful. And on the flip side, the West is becoming less powerful. And I think that's one of the things that's driving the Quad, the expansion, the Quad AUKUS, the expansion of NATO into the Pacific, is this desperation to try and regain some of that strength. But what that's doing is raising the stakes of war. And I think, it's one thing talking in the abstract about war, but from Australia's perspective, talking about war with China creates that sort of visceral reaction, because it would just simply be devastating on so many levels. So I think, obviously, that's something I'm really concerned about, and a lot of people are concerned about in Australia. But we need to use it as an opportunity to get people on board, to speak up. And it seems like we've got some momentum now, thanks to the announcement of AUKUS. So we need to keep using that to keep arguing the case as to why it's a bad idea, and why we need to take our foot off the pedal with regards to our issues with China, and start to talk through them, and also put the pressure on the United States to calm down a little bit as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So before I ask June, I just want to make one point, and that is the reason this region, it's in naming, earlier it was called Asia Pacific, now it's called Indo-Pacific for a specific reason also. It's not just about the Pacific or Asia, because the Indian Ocean also extends to East Africa and the Middle East. So you can see the extension of the strategy of the Indo-Pacific militarization. So June, if you can, your 1 minute for summing up.
Thank you very much for your invitation to speak here. I was very surprised to know that in Northern Marianas, the destruction and the militarization is going on in place of Guam and I learned a lot also from movement in South Korea and Australia. So the military competition, through the military competition, the United States tries to maintain its hegemony all over the world and involving all the allies in their own strategy. It's just very foolish and very dangerous. But beyond that strategy, there is no peace. In the ongoing militarization all over Japan, they are trying to set up more shelters and also turning all the civil airports and ports for the military use. So involving all the citizens all over Japan, we will work hard to contribute to build a peaceful and nuclear-free world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, Sung-Hee?
Thank you so much for organizers, to give this, great chance to learn one another. I wanted to emphasize the 2 points. The first one is this kind of military intensification is at the cost of the domestic democracy deterioration. For example, in South Korea, activists are being imprisoned under the charges of national security law. 2 activists in Jeju have already been imprisoned, and another activist could be imprisoned soon. My point is that this is the very dangerous time that the people's voices are, oppressed, suppressed. And then I find that many of our resistance stories are being removed in the media. It is not only in Korea, I guess it is all over the world. That's why this kind of the information sharing and then strengthening our solidarity and friendship, which is very critical more than ever. So I really appreciate to all the organizers and then the fellow presenters and all the participants. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Theresa, the concluding point.
Yeah, I just building off of that exactly. I think the Pentagon strategy is always to segment, right, in so many different ways, and I mean that in so many different ways, right? Whether it's environmental impact statements, whether it's kind of shielding the resistance movements from each other or not addressing them properly. And so bringing these voices together, and I'm also very grateful that I'm on this panel with all of you wonderful and amazing folks, because we're getting to tell these stories to each other so that we can connect on that level, on that personal level. It's not out of sight. We're all not out of sight and out of mind. We're all deeply connected in all of this. And so I think part of our job is to really create that holistic picture for people to understand the movement of militarization that's happening more broadly in the region, right? We're not just a bunch of specks in the middle of the ocean. And so to kind of reiterate a point that World Beyond War has mentioned, a kind of myth that's out there, is to remind ourselves that war is not inevitable. We don't have to go to war, right? Like even in our histories, or at least in the Marianas, we have so much history with World War II, and hearing grandparents' stories about World War II, but there's nothing about us or anyone else for that matter that make us more prone to war. And so if we can continue to kind of bind together and tell each other, our stories and our experiences, I think we can strengthen our own kind of alliance, our advocacy, our archipelagos of advocacy in this story. And so I just also wanted to thank the organizers for this wonderful space and opportunity to be able to hear from each other. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Theresa. Before I thank all of you, there's one more question which has suddenly come up, which says, what is the role of the UN in today's situation? And I think we've all seen that the UN does continue to make statements, it has its charter, but since it's dominated by states and powerful states, those views are also reflected. So with that, really, I'd like to thank all our panelists for their wonderful interventions. I want to thank IPB, the interpreters, the organizers, the Asia-Europe People's Forum, and everyone who's done the technical, and especially Cora and others who've taken this forward. We will put the entire recording up on several of our websites. So, and I hope we can put Anne's slideshow also separately. So we look forward to that, and all of you can see this once again. Thank you very much, and this is where we will close.